The planet Marcus had brought them to wasn't on any official star charts. New Terra was a human colony world, one of dozens that had been established during the Great Expansion period 20 years ago. Most aliens had never heard of it, which made it perfect for hiding. The settlement itself was small, maybe 10,000 people spread across a handful of farming communities and one modest spaceport. As they descended through the atmosphere, Lyra could see vast fields of crops that looked vaguely familiar, though adapted for the local soil and climate. "This is where you're from?" she asked, watching Marcus's face as he piloted them toward the landing pad. "Born and raised. Left when I was 18 to see the galaxy, but I come back when I need to think or when things get too complicated out there." He gestured toward the settlement below. The hegemony barely knows humans exist as a spacefaring species. They definitely don't know about our colony worlds. The spaceport was simple but functional, and the few beings they could see working there were all human. Marcus set the Lucky Strike down gently and began shutting down the engines. "We should be safe here while we figure out our next move," he said. "My family has a farm about 20 kilometers from town. We can stay there as long as we need to." Lyra looked uncertain. "Your family won't mind harboring a fugitive?" Marcus laughed. "You clearly don't know much about humans. We have a saying, 'The enemy of my enemy is my friend.' The fact that the hegemony wants you will make you welcome here." They were met at the landing pad by a tall woman with graying hair and Marcus's same dark eyes. She embraced him warmly before turning to study Lyra with frank curiosity. "Mom, this is Lyra. She's the one I told you about on the comm. Lyra, this is my mother, Sarah Chen." Sarah extended her hand in the human greeting gesture. "Any enemy of the hegemony is welcome in our home. Marcus told me a little about your situation." Lyra shook the offered hand, surprised by the firm grip and the genuine warmth in the older woman's eyes. "Thank you for your hospitality. I know this puts you at risk." "Risk?" Sarah laughed, a sound very much like her son's. "Honey, we've been fighting the hegemony's trade restrictions and territorial demands for 15 years. Having you here isn't additional risk, it's an opportunity." As they traveled toward the Chen family farm in an old ground vehicle, Marcus explained more about New Terra's situation. "The hegemony considers this sector their territory, even though we were here first. They've been pressuring our government to accept protection in exchange for trade concessions and mining rights." Translation, Sarah added, "They want to turn us into a client state. Strip our resources and use our people as cheap labor." Lyra listened with growing interest. "But your government has refused?" "So far. Humans don't take kindly to being told what to do by outsiders. But the pressure is getting worse, and some people are starting to think maybe we should accept their terms rather than risk a war we can't win." The Chen farm was larger than Lyra had expected, stretching for kilometers in all directions. The main house was a comfortable 2-story structure surrounded by barns, equipment sheds, and processing facilities. Workers moved through the fields, tending crops that would feed not just New Terra, but several other human colonies. "It's beautiful," Lyra said softly as they pulled up to the house. "It's home," Marcus replied simply. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Marcus's father joined them. David Chen was a weathered man with calloused hands and the same intelligent eyes as his son and wife. He listened quietly as Marcus and Lyra explained the situation in more detail. "So the hegemony is using slavery by proxy," he said finally, "forcing people into debt and then claiming their family members as payment." "It's an old tactic," Lyra confirmed. "They've used it on dozens of worlds. The victims usually disappear into their black sites, never to be seen again." David was quiet for a long moment, then looked at his son. "You did the right thing bringing her here. But you know they won't just give up." "I know. That's why we need to figure out our next move." Lyra had been thinking about that same question. "There might be a way to stop them," she said slowly. "But it would require exposing my true identity, and that comes with its own risks." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "I told Marcus that I'm Velthari nobility, but I didn't explain exactly what that means. My father isn't just the High Counselor, he's also the leader of the Velthari resistance movement. My people have been fighting hegemony expansion for decades." Marcus leaned forward. "Resistance movement. The hegemony likes to portray themselves as peaceful traders, bringing civilization to the galaxy. In reality, they're conquistadors, taking what they want by force when economic pressure doesn't work. The Velthari were one of the first species to recognize this, and we've been organizing opposition ever since. Why haven't we heard about this? David asked. Because the hegemony controls most of the galaxy's communication networks. They suppress news that doesn't fit their narrative. Lyra's eyes glowed faintly in the growing darkness. But if I could get word to my father, if I could tell him about what's happening to the human colonies, he might be able to help. What kind of help? Marcus wanted to know. Military assistance. Economic support. The Velthari have allies among other species who've suffered under hegemony expansion. Together, we might be strong enough to protect worlds like New Terra. Sarah looked thoughtful. That would mean war. War is coming whether we want it or not, Lyra replied. The only question is whether your people will face it alone or with allies. Marcus stood and paced to the edge of the porch. How do we get a message to your father without the hegemony intercepting it? There are ways. Old trade routes that predate hegemony control, independent courier services that specialize in avoiding their patrols. It would be dangerous, but possible. I know some people, Marcus said slowly. Smugglers mostly, but they know the back routes better than anyone. If we could get to the Kepler system, there's a guy named Torres who specializes in running hegemony blockades. David shook his head. Son, you're talking about involving our entire world in a galactic conflict. That's not a decision you can make alone. You're right. But I can make the decision to help Lyra contact her father. What happens after that is up to the politicians. Later that night, as the family discussed the logistics of their plan, Lyra found herself on the porch alone, looking up at the unfamiliar constellations. Marcus joined her, carrying 2 cups of something warm that smelled like cinnamon. Having second thoughts? He asked, offering her one of the cups. Many of them. If we do this, if we contact my father, there's no going back. The hegemony will know where I am, and they'll come here in force. Maybe. Or maybe we'll finally have the strength to push back. Marcus sipped his drink. Can I ask you something? Of course. Back at the station when I said you were free, you seemed surprised. Why? Lyra was quiet for a long moment. In 3 years of marriage to Zektar, no one had ever asked what I wanted. I was property, to be traded or sold or wagered as he saw fit. When you said I was free, it was the first time anyone had offered me a choice. And now? She looked at him, her violet eyes reflecting the starlight. Now I'm choosing to fight. Not because someone is forcing me to, but because it's what I want to do. Your species has a concept of freedom that most of the galaxy has forgotten. Maybe it's time to remind them. Marcus nodded. Then we'll get you to Torres and you can send your message. But I want you to know, whatever happens next, you'll always have a place here. Humans take care of their own. Even though I'm not human, Marcus smiled. Anyone who chooses freedom over safety, who stands up to bullies and refuses to be owned, is human enough for us. Species doesn't matter. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sarah burst into the kitchen where Marcus and Lyra were having breakfast, her face pale with shock. Turn on the newsfeed, she said urgently. The holographic display showed a familiar sight. Hegemony warships surrounding a space station. But this wasn't just any station. It was the main trade hub for the entire sector. Hegemony forces have occupied Trade Station Alpha 7, the reporter was saying. They claim they're investigating terrorist activities, but all communication with the station has been cut off. Independent sources suggest this may be retaliation for recent interference with hegemony operations. Marcus and Lyra exchanged looks. They both knew this was about them. It's starting, Lyra said quietly. They're making their move earlier than expected. Then we need to make ours, Marcus replied. We leave for the Kepler system today. But as they prepared to depart, they had no idea that their escape from the gambling station had already set in motion events that would reshape the entire galaxy. The hegemony's patience was at an end, and they were done playing games. Real war was coming to the outer rim, and humanity was about to get its first taste of galactic conflict. The question was whether they would survive it. The small cafe on the station's upper level was a stark contrast to the gambling den below. Clean, well-lit, and mostly empty at this hour, it provided the privacy that Marcus and Lyra needed for their conversation. She sat across from him, her silver skin still glowing faintly in the soft lighting. You said there were things I should know, Marcus began. nursing a cup of coffee that probably cost more than most beings made in a day. I'm listening. Lyra wrapped her delicate hands around her own cup, something that steamed and smelled faintly of flowers. Zektar didn't lose tonight because of bad luck. He lost because he was meant to lose. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? 3 weeks ago, representatives from the hegemony approached my husband. They offered him a deal that seemed too good to refuse. She paused, her violet eyes distant. You see, the Velthari possess certain abilities that the hegemony finds very valuable. Our psychic powers can be used to predict market fluctuations, influence negotiations, even scan the minds of enemies. They've been trying to acquire Velthari slaves for decades. The human's expression darkened. The hegemony was a collection of alien species that controlled a significant portion of the galaxy's trade routes. They weren't officially involved in slavery, but everyone knew they turned a blind eye to it when it suited their purposes. But slavery was outlawed by the Galactic Accord, Marcus said. Technically, yes, but marriage contracts are still legal, and if a husband accumulates enough debt, his wife can be transferred as payment. It's an old loophole that most civilized worlds have closed, but out here in the Rim territories it still applies. Marcus was beginning to understand. So they set up your husband to lose everything, knowing that eventually he'd bet you. Exactly. They've been manipulating his gambling for weeks, letting him win small amounts to build his confidence, then arranging for bigger losses when it mattered. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination. Zektar would lose me to one of their agents, and I would disappear into their black sites. But I won instead. Lyra nodded, which they definitely didn't plan for. The hegemony doesn't know much about humans yet. Your species is still relatively new to galactic society. They underestimated you. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing this information. So what happens now? They'll just try again with someone else? Perhaps. Or they might try more direct methods. The hegemony doesn't like it when their plans are disrupted. She met his eyes. You've put yourself in danger by interfering, whether you meant to or not. The human shrugged. I've been in danger before. It comes with the territory when you make a living gambling in places like this. This is different. The hegemony has resources that individual criminals don't. They can make people disappear or arrange for accidents to happen. And they really want what I represent. Marcus studied her carefully. What exactly do you represent? You mentioned psychic abilities, but there's more to it than that, isn't there? Lyra hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I'm not just any Velthari. I'm a member of the royal family, daughter of the High Counselor. My psychic abilities are stronger than most of my people, strong enough to influence entire populations if properly focused. In the wrong hands, I could be used to manipulate elections, start wars, or crash entire economies. Jesus, Marcus breathed. No wonder they want you. My marriage to Zektar was arranged to hide my identity. He's minor nobility from a border world, unremarkable enough that no one would think to look for me there. It worked for 3 years until his gambling addiction attracted the wrong kind of attention. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking. So what do you want to do? I meant what I said. You're free to go wherever you want. That's just it, Lyra said softly. I don't know if anywhere is truly safe anymore. The hegemony has a long reach, and they're patient. They'll keep trying until they get what they want. Then we make sure they don't get it. She looked up sharply. We? You helped me understand what was really going on tonight. The least I can do is help you stay free. Marcus leaned forward. Besides, I've never liked bullies, especially ones who think they can own other people. Lyra stared at him for a long moment. You barely know me. Why would you risk your life for a stranger? Because it's the right thing to do. And because someone needs to stand up to these bastards. He paused. There's something else too. You said the hegemony doesn't know much about humans yet. Maybe it's time they learned. What do you mean? Marcus smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't entirely friendly. Humans have a reputation for being stubborn, unpredictable, and harder to kill than we look. We also don't like being told what we can and can't do. The hegemony wants to play games? Let's show them how humans play. Before Lyra could respond, the cafe's lights flickered. Both of them looked up as a low humming sound filled the air. Through the large windows, they could see ships moving into position around the station, their hulls bearing the distinctive markings of the hegemony fleet. They're not wasting any time, Marcus observed. Lyra's eyes began to glow as she extended her psychic senses. 6 ships, all military grade. They're scanning the station, looking for my psychic signature. We have maybe 10 minutes before they pinpoint our location. Marcus stood and tossed some credits on the table. Then we better move. Do you have any way off this station? Zektar's ship is impounded for debt, and I don't have access to any others. She looked worried for the first time since they'd started talking. Lucky for you, I do. Marcus headed toward the exit, pausing to look back at her. Coming? Lyra rose gracefully and followed him. Where are we going? To collect my winnings and get the hell out of here. I've got a ship docked in Bay 94, and she's fast enough to outrun anything the hegemony has in their standard fleet. They made their way quickly through the station's corridors, avoiding the main thoroughfares where hegemony troops were likely to be deployed. Marcus led them through maintenance passages and service tunnels that he'd memorized during his stay on the station. How do you know about these passages? Lyra asked as they crawled through a particularly narrow duct. I make it a point to know all the exits before I sit down to gamble. You never know when you might need to leave in a hurry. They emerged near the docking bays, and Marcus could see hegemony soldiers setting up checkpoints at the main entrances. But Bay 94 was in an older section of the station, one that had its own maintenance access. There she is, Marcus said proudly as they entered the bay. The Lucky Strike. Lyra looked at the ship with surprise. It was smaller than she'd expected, but sleek and well-maintained. The hull was a matte black that seemed to absorb light, and the engine configuration suggested it was built for speed rather than cargo capacity. She doesn't look like much, Marcus admitted, but she's never let me down. Modified engines, upgraded shields, and enough firepower to discourage casual pursuit. As they boarded, Lyra could feel the psychic residue of the ship's previous journeys. Marcus wasn't just a gambler, she realized. The ship had seen combat, had been places where violence was common. Her estimation of the human began to shift. Strap in, Marcus called from the pilot's seat. This might get interesting. The ship's engines hummed to life, and Marcus began the undocking sequence. Outside, they could see hegemony patrol ships moving to block the station's main exit routes. They're trying to seal us in, Lyra observed. That's why we're not using the main routes. Marcus's fingers flew over the controls. Hold on! The Lucky Strike shot out of the docking bay like a bullet, immediately diving toward the asteroid field that surrounded the station. Alarm klaxons began wailing, and the hegemony ships moved to intercept. This is Hegemony Cruiser Dominion, a voice crackled over the comm. Unknown vessel, return to the station immediately or we will open fire. Marcus switched off the comm. What they don't know, he said conversationally, is that I've been through this asteroid field dozens of times. I know every rock, every safe passage. The ship twisted and dove between massive asteroids, using their bulk to break the targeting locks of the pursuing vessels. Energy blasts lit up space around them, but Marcus's piloting kept them just ahead of the worst of it. There, he said, pointing to what looked like a solid wall of rock ahead. The Needle's Eye. Lyra gripped her armrests as the ship dove toward what appeared to be certain death. At the last second, she could see it, a narrow passage between two asteroids barely wide enough for their ship. They shot through the gap with meters to spare on either side. Behind them, the larger hegemony ships couldn't follow. They would have to go around, giving Marcus and Lyra the head start they needed. Where are we going? Lyra asked as they cleared the asteroid field and jumped to hyperspace. Somewhere the hegemony won't think to look, Marcus replied. I know a place. The crimson lights of the gambling den cast strange shadows across Zektar's scaled face as he stared at the human sitting across from him. The establishment, built into the asteroid mining station of Kepler 442, attracted the worst kinds of beings from across the galaxy. Pirates, smugglers, and those desperate enough to bet their last credits on games of chance. Captain Marcus Chen looked ordinary enough by human standards. Average height, dark hair beginning to show gray at the temples, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. What made him dangerous wasn't his appearance, but his reputation. Every spacer in 3 sectors had heard stories about the human who had never lost a bet. Zektar's wife, Lyra, stood silently behind his chair. Her people, the Velthari, were known throughout the galaxy for their ethereal beauty and incredible psychic abilities. Her silver skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and her large violet eyes held depths that most beings found unsettling. The delicate patterns that decorated her arms and neck marked her as nobility among her kind. She had been watching the game for hours now, her expression carefully neutral. Zektar had already lost his ship, his mining rights, and most of his family's fortune. The pile of credit chips in front of the human had grown steadily larger as the night wore on. "You're quite skilled," Zektar admitted, his forked tongue flicking out nervously. "But I have one more bet to make." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You've got nothing left worth betting, friend. Maybe it's time to call it a night." The Velthari noble's laugh was bitter. "Oh, but I do have something of value left." He gestured toward Lyra without looking at her. "My wife." A hush fell over the crowded den. Even the drunk Cargonian in the corner stopped his loud bragging to stare. Betting one's spouse wasn't unheard of in the Outer Rim territories, but it was considered barbaric by most civilized species. Marcus studied Lyra carefully. She hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked, but he could sense the tension radiating from her. "That's not how I play," he said quietly. "Afraid you'll finally lose?" Zektar taunted. The great Marcus Chen backing down from a wager? The human's jaw tightened. "I don't bet on people's lives. She's not people, she's Velthari, and she's mine by right of marriage contract. The bet stands whether you accept it or not. If I lose this hand, she goes to whoever beats me. If you won't play, I'll find someone who will." Marcus glanced around the room. Several other patrons were already eyeing Lyra with obvious interest. A grotesque hut-like creature in the corner was practically drooling. The human realized that if he walked away, Zektar would indeed find someone else to play against, and that someone might not have any moral qualms about the situation. "What are the terms?" Marcus asked reluctantly. Zektar smiled, showing his pointed teeth. "Simple. 1 hand of galactic stud. Winner takes all." He pushed his remaining chips forward. "I'm betting everything I have left plus Lyra against your entire winnings tonight." For the first time since the conversation began, Lyra spoke. Her voice was melodic, with the slight harmonic undertones that all Velthari possessed. "I have no say in this matter." "You know the law," Zektar snapped. "Marriage contracts are binding until death or formal dissolution. You belong to me until someone else wins you fairly." Marcus felt sick to his stomach, but he also knew that walking away would only make things worse for Lyra. At least if he won, he could set her free. "Fine, 1 hand. But when I win, she goes free." "If you win," Zektar corrected. "But you won't, I can feel it." "My luck is about to change." The dealer, a mechanical being with multiple arms, shuffled the cards with practiced efficiency. The crowd pressed closer as word spread throughout the den. Marcus noticed that several of the station's security guards had appeared, but they made no move to intervene. Gambling was the lifeblood of places like this, and as long as no one drew weapons, they stayed out of it. The cards were dealt. Marcus picked up his hand and kept his expression carefully neutral. He had learned long ago not to show any emotion while gambling, regardless of what cards he held. Across the table, Zektar's scaled features were harder to read, but Marcus caught the slight widening of his yellow eyes. "I'll see your bet," the alien said, pushing his chips forward. "And I'll raise you." He gestured toward Lyra again. "She's worth more than all the credits on this table." Marcus looked at his cards again. He had a decent hand, but nothing spectacular. In a normal game, he might fold and wait for better odds. But this wasn't a normal game. A woman's freedom hung in the balance. "I call," he said simply. Zektar laid down his cards first. Full house, kings over tens. It was a strong hand, one that would win most games. The alien's smile widened as he reached toward the pile of chips. "Not so fast," Marcus said quietly. He laid down his own cards one by one. Straight flush 7 through jack of stars. The silence in the room was deafening. Zektar stared at the cards as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The human had won with one of the best possible hands in the game. "No," Zektar whispered. "This can't be happening." "Not again." Marcus began gathering the chips, but his attention was focused on Lyra. "You're free," he told her. "The debt is paid, and I'm releasing any claim on you." For the first time all evening, real emotion crossed her features. Surprise, then something that might have been gratitude. But before she could respond, Zektar erupted from his chair. "You cheated!" he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "No one is that lucky. You had to have cheated." Security guards began moving toward their table, but Marcus remained calm. "I won fairly, and you know it. The dealer is mechanical and impartial. The cards speak for themselves." Zektar's hand moved toward the energy weapon at his belt, but before he could draw it, Lyra stepped forward. Her eyes began to glow with an inner light, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Enough, she said, and her voice carried a power that made everyone present take a step back. The game is over. Honor the result. The Velthari's psychic abilities were legendary, and even Zektar wasn't foolish enough to challenge her when she was using them. His hand fell away from his weapon, and he slumped back into his chair. Marcus stood slowly, keeping his movements non-threatening. Like I said, you're free. You can go wherever you want, do whatever you want. I have no claim on you. Lyra studied him with those unsettling violet eyes. You would truly release me? Even though you won me fairly according to the laws of this sector? I don't believe in owning people, Marcus replied. Never have, never will. Something shifted in her expression. Then perhaps we should talk, Marcus Chen. There are things you should know about tonight's game, and about my husband's recent string of losses. Things that might interest a man who values freedom as much as you seem to. The journey to the Kepler system would take 3 days through hyperspace, following routes that most respectable spacers avoided. Marcus had modified the Lucky Strike's navigation computer years ago to include data from smugglers, pirates, and other individuals who preferred to travel without official oversight. These passages weren't designed for regular traffic, Marcus explained as they jumped from star to star. They're older hyperspace routes discovered before the hegemony standardized galactic travel. Harder to navigate, more dangerous, but almost impossible to patrol effectively. Lyra sat in the co-pilot seat, watching the swirling colors of hyperspace flow past the viewports. She had been unusually quiet since leaving New Terra, and Marcus could sense her growing tension. You're worried about contacting your father, he observed. I'm worried about what happens after I contact him. Once the Velthari resistance knows where I am, they'll want me to come home. And if I refuse, they might decide I'm too valuable to leave in hegemony territory. Marcus looked at her sharply. You think your own people would force you to return? Not force, exactly. But they would make it very clear that my duty lies with my people, not with a single human colony. She turned to meet his gaze. The Resistance has been fighting this war for 50 years, Marcus. They've made sacrifices that you can't imagine. From their perspective, my personal freedom is a luxury they can't afford. And from your perspective? Lyra was quiet for a long moment. I've spent my entire life being told what my duty was. First by my family, then by my husband, now potentially by the Resistance. For 3 days since you said I was free, I've been able to make my own choices. I'm not sure I'm ready to give that up. Before Marcus could respond, the ship's proximity alarms began sounding. He quickly switched to manual control and dropped out of hyperspace, finding himself facing a sight that made his blood run cold. 3 hegemony patrol ships hung in space ahead of them, weapons powered and ready. They had been waiting. Unknown vessel, this is hegemony patrol leader Vexkoth. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded. Marcus's hands flew over the controls, bringing shields online and charging the ship's weapons. How did they find us? Lyra's eyes were glowing as she extended her psychic senses. I can feel another Velthari on one of those ships. They're using her to track my psychic signature. Can you block it? Not while maintaining consciousness. And if I pass out, you'll have to pilot and fight alone. Marcus grinned, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. Wouldn't be the first time. Hold on. The Lucky Strike shot forward like an arrow released from a bow. The hegemony ships, built for patrol duty rather than speed, were caught off guard by the sudden acceleration. Energy blasts filled the space around them, but Marcus's evasive maneuvers kept them just ahead of the targeting computers. There, he pointed to a nearby gas giant surrounded by a ring system. If we can reach the rings, we can lose them in the debris field. The chase through the ring system was harrowing. Ice chunks the size of buildings crashed against their shields, while Marcus threaded the needle between larger obstacles. The hegemony ships, larger and less maneuverable, fell behind as they were forced to navigate more carefully. We're going to make it, Marcus said as they cleared the worst of the debris. That's when the 4th ship appeared, dropping out of hyperspace directly in front of them. This one was different from the patrol vessels, sleeker and more heavily armed. A hegemony hunter-killer, designed specifically for pursuit and elimination of high-value targets. This is Commander Sektar of the hegemony vessel Retribution. Surrender the Velthari female and your death will be quick. Marcus pulled back on the controls, bringing the Lucky Strike to a relative stop. The hunter-killer had them dead to rights, its weapons locked on and ready to fire. Options? He asked quietly. Lyra was studying the larger ship with her enhanced senses. The Velthari aboard is being held against her will. I can feel her pain, her fear. If I could free her, could you take control of their ship? Possibly, but I would need to be closer, and they would have to drop their psychic shielding. Marcus looked at the tactical display, calculating angles and distances. The other 3 patrol ships were closing fast from behind, and the hunter-killer's weapons would tear them apart if they tried to run. I've got an idea, he said, but you're not going to like it. I'm listening. We surrender. Let them take us aboard. Once we're inside their shields, you should be able to reach the other Velthari. Lyra stared at him. That's insane. They'll kill you the moment they have me. Maybe. Or maybe they'll want to interrogate us first, find out who else knows about their operation. Marcus was already reaching for the communication controls. Either way, it's better than dying out here. Before Lyra could object, Marcus opened a channel to the hunter-killer. Retribution, this is Captain Chen of the Lucky Strike. We surrender, requesting permission to come aboard. There was a pause, then Commander Sektar's voice returned. Wise choice, Captain. Dock with our port bay. Any attempt at trickery will result in immediate destruction. As they approached the larger vessel, Lyra placed her hand on Marcus's arm. You don't have to do this. You could escape in the confusion once I start fighting. I told you, humans don't abandon their friends. Marcus looked at her seriously. Besides, someone needs to make sure you get that message to your father. The docking process was smooth, and within minutes they found themselves surrounded by armed hegemony soldiers. Commander Sektar was a tall insectoid being with 4 arms and compound eyes that missed nothing. So, he said, studying them both, the famous Marcus Chen and the missing Velthari princess. You've caused us considerable trouble. Princess? Marcus glanced at Lyra, who looked uncomfortable. Oh yes, did she not mention that detail? Lyra is not merely nobility, she is heir to the Velthari throne. Her psychic abilities are among the strongest ever recorded by her species. They were escorted through the ship's corridors toward what was obviously a detention area. But as they walked, Lyra began to sense something else. The other Velthari was close, very close. She's on this level, she whispered to Marcus. 3 doors down from where they're taking us. Marcus nodded, almost imperceptibly. As they passed the indicated door, he stumbled and bumped into one of the guards. In the confusion, he managed to activate a small electromagnetic pulse device hidden in his jacket. The lights flickered, and for just a moment the ship's electronic systems wavered. That moment was all Lyra needed. Her consciousness expanded, reaching out through the briefly weakened barriers to touch the mind of the other Velthari. What she found there filled her with rage. The woman had been tortured, her mind violated repeatedly as the hegemony forced her to use her abilities to track others of her kind. She was barely sane, held together only by a desperate desire to see her people free. Lyra flooded her with strength and comfort, then gave her a choice. Together they could take control of this ship and escape. Or they could die trying. The response was immediate and fierce. The other Velthari might be broken, but she was far from defeated. Power surged through the ship as both women combined their abilities. Lights exploded, computer systems overloaded, and several of the guards collapsed as psychic feedback overwhelmed their nervous systems. Now! Lyra shouted. Marcus was already moving. The EMP device had been a decoy. His real weapons were the small charges he had planted throughout the ship during their walk to detention. As the guards struggled to understand what was happening, explosions rocked the vessel. In the chaos that followed, Marcus and Lyra fought their way back toward the docking bay. The other Velthari, freed from her cell by the system failures, joined them. She was painfully thin and scarred from her captivity, but her eyes burned with purpose. The patrol ships, she gasped. They'll follow us. No, Lyra said grimly. They won't. As they reached the Lucky Strike, Lyra and her fellow Velthari joined their minds once more. This time, instead of simply overloading systems, they reached out to the patrol ships that were scrambling to respond. One by one, the vessels found their navigation computers corrupted, their weapon systems failing, their engines shutting down. Impressive, Marcus said as they undocked and accelerated away from the crippled hunter-killer. Remind me never to make you angry, but Lyra wasn't finished. As they jumped back into hyperspace, she sent out a psychic pulse that would be felt by every Velthari within 50 light years. It was a message of hope, a signal that resistance was possible, that the hegemony could be fought and beaten. More importantly, it was a call to arms that would reach her father within hours. Now they know for certain where I am, she said, as they settled into their course for the Kepler system. The war is coming whether we're ready for it or not. Marcus looked at their rescued passenger, who was sleeping fitfully in the ship's small medical bay. Was it worth it? Lyra considered the question. Ask me again when this is over. But yes, I think it was. We saved one person today, and we proved that the hegemony isn't invincible. Sometimes that's how revolutions start. As they continued toward their destination, none of them knew that their actions had already begun to change the balance of power in the galaxy. The hegemony's commanders were realizing that humans were more dangerous than they had believed, and the Velthari resistance way. Resistance was possible, that the hegemony could be fought and beaten. More importantly, it was a call to arms that would reach her father within hours. Now they know for certain where I am, she said as they settled into their course for the Kepler system. The war is coming whether we're ready for it or not. Marcus looked at their rescued passenger, who was sleeping fitfully in the ship's small medical bay. Was it worth it? Lyra considered the question. Ask me again when this is over. But yes, I think it was. We saved one person today, and we proved that the hegemony isn't invincible. Sometimes that's how revolutions start. As they continued toward their destination, none of them knew that their actions had already begun to change the balance of power in the galaxy. The hegemony's commanders were realizing that humans were more dangerous than they had believed, and the Velthari resistance was mobilizing its forces for the largest operation in decades. The Kepler system was a smuggler's paradise, filled with asteroid fields, nebula clouds, and dozens of hidden bases where questions weren't asked and credit spoke louder than laws. Marcus guided the Lucky Strike through a maze of obstacles toward a coordinates that existed on no official charts. Torres Station was built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, its existence known only to those who needed to move cargo without hegemony interference. As they docked, Marcus could see ships from a dozen different species, all bearing the subtle modifications that marked them as vessels that operated outside legal boundaries. Stay close, Marcus warned as they disembarked. Some of the people here shoot first and check identification afterward. The rescued Velthari woman, who had told them her name was Kira, walked between Marcus and Lyra. She was still weak from her captivity, but her psychic abilities were slowly returning to full strength. Torres himself was exactly what Marcus had expected. A grizzled human with cybernetic implants covering half his face and arms that had been replaced by mechanical substitutes. He operated from a bar deep within the station, where deals were made over drinks that could dissolve metal. Marcus Chen, Torres said with a grin that showed several gold teeth. Haven't seen you in 2 years? Last time you were here, you were running from those Klingon pirates who caught you cheating at cards. I wasn't cheating, I was counting cards. There's a difference. Not to the pirates. Torres's gaze shifted to Lyra and Kira. And you brought company. Very attractive company, if I may say so. You may not, Marcus replied firmly. We need passage to Velthari space, and we need it without the hegemony knowing about it. Torres's expression grew serious. That's a tall order, my friend. The hegemony has been cracking down on independent operators lately. Half the routes to Velthari territory are being patrolled. But not all of them? No, not all. There's still the Nexus route, but that goes through the Badlands. Most captains won't risk it. Marcus knew about the Badlands, a region of space where gravitational anomalies and energy storms made navigation nearly impossible. Ships that entered rarely came out again. What would it cost to hire someone willing to risk it? Torres named a figure that made Marcus wince. It was everything he had won at the gambling station, plus most of his savings. That's highway robbery, Marcus protested. That's the price of doing business when the hegemony wants you dead. Torres leaned back in his chair. Of course, there might be another way. Word is you caused quite a stir when you escaped their hunter-killer. Some of my clients are very interested in meeting the people who pulled that off. Within an hour, Marcus and Lyra found themselves in a hidden conference room, surrounded by representatives from a dozen different resistance groups. There were humans from colony worlds threatened by hegemony expansion, Zephyrians whose home system had been strip-mined for resources, and even a few hegemony species who had grown disgusted with their government's methods. We've been fighting separate wars for too long, said Captain Elena Vasquez, representing the United Human Colonies. The hegemony picks us off one at a time because we're not coordinated. The Velthari resistance has been trying to build alliances for decades. added a scarred Zephyrian named Tholek. But most species are too afraid of hegemony retaliation to openly oppose them. Marcus listened as they outlined the situation. The hegemony controlled roughly 60% of known space, but their power was based more on fear than actual strength. Individual member species often had grievances, but lacked the coordination to effectively resist. What we need, Lyra said quietly, is proof that the hegemony can be beaten. Something dramatic enough to inspire others to join the resistance. Like what? Asked Vasquez. Kira spoke for the first time since entering the room. The facility where they held me isn't just for Velthari prisoners. They have psychics from dozens of species there, all being forced to use their abilities for hegemony purposes. If we could free them, expose what's happening. Where is this facility? Tholek demanded. Sigma Station in the Rigel system. It's heavily defended, but most of the defenses are designed to keep people in, not out. Marcus was studying a star chart on the room's holographic display. Rigel is deep in hegemony space. Getting there would be suicide. Not necessarily, said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a figure in a hooded cloak entering the room. When she lowered the hood, Lyra gasped. Virashin! The newcomer was clearly Velthari, with the same silver skin and violet eyes as Lyra, but her bearing spoke of authority and command. Hello, my daughter. Your daughter? Marcus asked, confused. Not biologically, Lyra explained quickly. Virashin trained me when I was young, taught me to use my abilities. She's like a second mother to me. Virashin studied the assembled group with calculating eyes. I bring word from the High Council. The resistance is mobilizing, but we need more than just military action. We need to change the narrative, show the galaxy that the hegemony is not the benevolent organization it claims to be. Exposing their prison camps would certainly do that, Vasquez observed. Yes, but the cost would be enormous. Sigma Station is protected by an entire fleet. What if we didn't attack the station directly? Marcus asked thoughtfully. What if we used their own tactics against them? Everyone looked at him expectantly. The hegemony maintains power through economic pressure as much as military force. They control the major trade routes, the shipping schedules, the communication networks. But what if those systems suddenly became unreliable? Virashin raised an eyebrow. You're talking about sabotage on a massive scale. I'm talking about using the same psychic abilities they're exploiting. If Velthari and other psychic species could coordinate their efforts, they could disrupt hegemony operations across multiple sectors simultaneously. Lyra was beginning to understand. Create enough chaos that they have to pull forces back from peripheral systems to protect their core territories. Exactly. And while they're dealing with that crisis, a small force could infiltrate Sigma Station and document what they find there. Tholek was skeptical. It's still incredibly dangerous. And even if it worked, how would we get the information out? The hegemony controls most communication networks. Leave that to us, said Torres, who had been listening from the bar. Smugglers have been moving more than just cargo for years. We've got an entire underground communication network that the hegemony doesn't even know exists. Over the next several hours, they planned what would become known as the Sigma Revelation. It was audacious, dangerous, and probably impossible. But it was also their best chance to expose the hegemony's crimes and rally galactic opinion against them. The plan required precise timing. Psychic operatives throughout hegemony space would simultaneously attack their infrastructure, creating widespread confusion. Meanwhile, a small infiltration team would penetrate Sigma Station and gather evidence of the hegemony's illegal activities. I'll lead the infiltration team, Marcus volunteered. No, Virashin said firmly. This requires someone with psychic abilities to communicate with the prisoners and bypass their security systems. Then I'll go, Lyra said. Absolutely not, Marcus protested. You're too valuable to risk. That's exactly why I have to go. The prisoners will trust me in a way they won't trust anyone else, and my abilities are strong enough to break their conditioning. The argument continued for several minutes before Kira spoke up. We both go. I know the layout of the facility, and Lyra has the power to free the prisoners. Between the two of us, we can get the evidence you need. And I go with them, Marcus added. Someone needs to watch their backs while they're focused on the psychic work. Virashin looked like she wanted to object, but Lyra cut her off. It's not your decision anymore. I'm free to make my own choices, remember? Freedom doesn't mean the right to commit suicide. No, but it means the right to fight for what you believe in. And I believe the hegemony needs to be stopped. The meeting broke up with teams assigned to different aspects of the operation. Marcus found himself alone with Lyra as they walked back to the Lucky Strike. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Once we start down this path, there's no going back." Lyra stopped walking and turned to face him. "Marcus, 3 days ago I was property to be wagered in a card game. Today I'm planning to strike a blow against one of the most powerful organizations in the galaxy. If that's not freedom, I don't know what is. Just promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that after this is over, you'll consider staying on New Terra. Not because anyone is forcing you to, but because you want to," she smiled. And for the first time since he had met her, it reached her eyes. "I promise I'll consider it. But first we have a war to win." As they prepared to depart for the most dangerous mission of their lives, neither of them realized that their actions had already begun to inspire resistance movements across the galaxy. The hegemony's reign of terror was about to face its greatest challenge yet, and it would all begin with a human who had refused to accept that people could be owned. The revolution was coming, and its first victory would be won not with weapons, but with the simple declaration that all beings deserved to be free. Sigma Station floated in the void like a metallic spider, its 8 arms extending into space and bristling with defensive weapons. The facility was enormous, large enough to house thousands of prisoners, and the hegemony personnel needed to control them. Marcus piloted the Lucky Strike through the asteroid field that concealed their approach, using every trick he had learned in years of evading authorities. The ship's hull had been coated with stealth material provided by the Resistance, and its energy signature was masked by technology that Torres had acquired through channels he refused to discuss. "The psychic disruption is beginning," Kira reported from the sensor station. "I can feel Velthari minds across the galaxy reaching out, touching hegemony systems." On the communication channels they were monitoring, reports were coming in of widespread system failures throughout hegemony space. Trade networks were crashing, military communications were being jammed, and navigation systems were providing false readings to hundreds of ships. "They're pulling ships back from the outer systems," Lyra observed, watching the tactical display. 3 destroyers just left orbit around the station." "That still leaves 2 cruisers and a battle station," Marcus noted. "The defenses are lighter, but they're still formidable." "Not for long," Kira said grimly. Her eyes began to glow as she reached out with her abilities. "The prisoners inside are responding. They remember me." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as the space around Sigma Station began to change. The defensive weapons turned slowly toward each other instead of outward. Communications arrays sparked and died. Even the lights inside the facility began to flicker. "The psychics inside are fighting back," Lyra breathed. "They're using their abilities to sabotage the station from within." "How many are there?" Marcus asked as he guided them toward a docking bay that had mysteriously lost its defensive shields. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. They've been collecting psychics for decades from dozens of species." Kira's voice was filled with pain and rage. "They're going to free themselves." The docking bay was in chaos when they arrived. Hegemony guards were running in all directions, trying to understand why their equipment was failing. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the artificial gravity fluctuated randomly. Marcus, Lyra, and Kira moved through the corridors like ghosts, guided by the psychic network that connected the prisoners. The station's security systems had been completely compromised, with cameras showing false images and sensors reporting phantom intruders in empty corridors. "This way," Kira whispered, leading them deeper into the facility. "The main detention area is on level 7. They found themselves in a vast chamber lined with thousands of cells. But these weren't ordinary prison cells. They were psychic dampening chambers, designed to suppress the abilities of those inside while still allowing the hegemony to exploit their powers when needed. The prisoners they could see were a heartbreaking mixture of species. Young Velthari torn from their families, elderly Zephyrian seers, human psionics who had never learned to control their abilities. All of them bore the marks of long captivity and psychological torture. "The recording equipment," Marcus said, activating a small device that would document everything they found. "This needs to be seen by the galaxy." As Lyra and Kira worked to free the prisoners, using their combined abilities to override the cell locks, Marcus moved through the facility documenting the horrors he found. laboratories where prisoners were subjected to experiments, training rooms where they were forced to use their abilities for hegemony purposes, medical facilities where their brains were studied and sometimes surgically altered. "Marcus!" Lyra called urgently. "You need to see this." She had found a computer terminal that contained detailed records of the hegemony's psychic program. The files revealed the scope of their operations: hundreds of facilities like Sigma Station, thousands of enslaved psychics, and plans to expand the program to every species in their territory. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In the deepest levels of the station, they found the research laboratories where the hegemony was working to create artificial psychics, beings whose minds had been surgically altered to grant them psychic abilities that could be completely controlled by their handlers. "They're trying to mass-produce psychic slaves," Kira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Beings with no free will, no ability to resist their commands." "Not anymore," Lyra said firmly. Her eyes blazed with psychic energy as she reached out to every experimental subject in the facility. "All of you, remember who you are. Remember your freedom." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Throughout the station, the artificial psychics began to reassert their original personalities, breaking free from the conditioning that had enslaved them. The hegemony researchers found themselves facing subjects who were not only uncontrolled, but actively hostile. "We need to go," Marcus said as alarms began blaring throughout the facility. "They're going to try to retake the station." But as they made their way back toward the Lucky Strike, they found their path blocked by a figure that made Lyra stop in her tracks. Commander Sektar, the insectoid officer who had captured them before, stood at the end of the corridor with a squad of heavily armed soldiers. "Enough," he said, raising a weapon that hummed with dangerous energy. "You have caused sufficient chaos. Surrender now and your deaths will be quick." "I don't think so," Lyra replied. She glanced at Kira, and both women's eyes began to glow in unison. What happened next would become legendary among the resistance. The two Velthari women, working in perfect harmony, reached out with their minds and touched every psychic being within the station. For just a moment, hundreds of different species and thousands of individual minds were united in a single purpose: freedom. The psychic wave that erupted from Sigma Station could be felt across light years. It was a declaration that rang through the minds of every psychic being in hegemony space. We are not property. We are not slaves. We are free. Commander Sektar and his soldiers collapsed as the wave washed over them, their nervous systems overwhelmed by the sheer power of so many minds acting as one. Throughout the station, hegemony personnel found themselves unconscious or fleeing in terror as their prisoners turned their abilities against their captors. "The cruisers are moving to intercept," Marcus reported as they reached the Lucky Strike. "But they're having problems of their own." Indeed, the hegemony ships were finding that their psychic crew members were no longer following orders. The wave from Sigma Station had awakened something in every psychic being throughout the sector, a refusal to be controlled that would spread like wildfire. As they escaped the station and jumped to hyperspace, Marcus began transmitting everything they had recorded to the smuggler network that Torres had arranged. Within hours, the evidence would be spreading throughout the galaxy, showing the true face of hegemony, benevolence. "Is it over?" Kira asked as they headed back toward Resistance territory. "This part is," Lyra replied, "but in a way it's just beginning. We've shown the galaxy that the hegemony can be fought, that their power isn't absolute. Now other species will find the courage to resist. And the hegemony won't take this lying down," Marcus added. "They'll retaliate, probably harder than ever before." "Let them," Lyra said, and there was steel in her voice. "They've just lost thousands of psychic slaves and had their crimes exposed to the entire galaxy. Their member species are going to start asking uncomfortable questions, and their enemies are going to smell weakness." Over the following days, as they made their way back to New Terra, they watched the galaxy change around them. The evidence from Sigma Station sparked outrage on hundreds of worlds. Species that had been considering joining the hegemony withdrew their applications. Member worlds began demanding investigations into their government's activities. Most importantly, resistance movements throughout hegemony space found new hope and coordination. The psychic network that had been established during the Sigma operation became the backbone of a galaxy-wide rebellion. "You did it," Marcus told Lyra as they sat in the ship's small observation lounge, watching the stars stream past. You freed not just those prisoners, but potentially millions of other beings. We did it, she corrected. All of us. The resistance, the smugglers, even your parents back on New Terra. Freedom isn't something one person can achieve alone. Marcus nodded, then looked at her seriously. So what happens now? Your people are going to want you back, probably more than ever. Lyra was quiet for a long moment. They'll want me to come home, take my place in the royal succession, help lead the resistance from Velthari space. She turned to meet his eyes. But I've learned something these past few days. Freedom isn't about accepting the role others expect you to play, even if that role is princess of your people. So what will you do? I'm going to go back to New Terra with you. Not because anyone is forcing me to, and not because I'm running away from my responsibilities, but because that's where I choose to be, she smiled. Besides, if this war is really coming, you're going to need all the help you can get. And I've become rather fond of humans and their stubborn refusal to accept the way things are. Marcus returned her smile. In that case, welcome to the human race. We're glad to have you, as the Lucky Strike Conti. 2 years had passed since the Sigma revelation, and the galaxy was a very different place. The hegemony still existed, but its iron grip on interstellar politics had been broken. Dozens of worlds had declared independence, and those that remained were demanding democratic reforms that would have been unthinkable before. Marcus stood on the porch of the Chen family farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. New Terra had become an unlikely center of the resistance movement, its small human population serving as a symbol of what free peoples could accomplish when they stood together. The farm itself had grown considerably. What had once been a simple agricultural operation now included facilities for training resistance fighters, manufacturing equipment for the rebellion, and providing refuge for those fleeing hegemony persecution. The latest reports from the front lines, Lyra said, joining him on the porch and handing him a data pad. She had changed in those 2 years, becoming not just a leader in the resistance, but a bridge between species that had never worked together before. Marcus scanned the information quickly. The siege of Arcturus is holding. The Zephyrian fleet has joined the blockade, and the hegemony forces are starting to run low on supplies. Better yet, 3 more systems have declared independence this week. The momentum is building. They had both changed, Marcus reflected. He was no longer a wandering gambler living on luck and skill. The resistance had given him purpose, and he now commanded a squadron of fast attack ships that specialized in hit-and-run tactics against hegemony supply lines. Lyra had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. The frightened woman who had been wagered in a card game was now one of the most respected leaders in the galaxy-wide rebellion. Her unique position as both Velthari royalty and someone who had experienced slavery made her a powerful voice for freedom. Your father wants to see you, Marcus said, reading further into the reports. The High Council is meeting next week to discuss the endgame strategy. Lyra nodded. I know. Virushin has been sending increasingly urgent messages. They want me to return to Velthari space permanently, take my place as heir apparent. And I keep telling them that the war isn't over yet. That my place is here with the frontline operations. Marcus set down the data pad and looked at her seriously. Lyra, you can't avoid this forever. You are the heir to the Velthari throne. Your people need you. Do they? Or do they just think they need me to fulfill some traditional role that was decided for me before I was born? Before Marcus could answer, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. A convoy of resistance fighters was returning from a mission, their ships bearing the scars of recent combat. Among them was the familiar hull of Kira's vessel, the Liberator. Kira had become something of a legend herself, leading missions to free psychic prisoners from hegemony facilities throughout the galaxy. The network of former prisoners she had assembled was now one of the Resistance's most effective intelligence operations. How did it go? Lyra asked as Kira climbed out of her ship. 17 more psychics freed from the Vega facility, Kira reported. But the hegemony is getting smarter. They're moving the prisoners more frequently, making them harder to track. They're also getting more desperate, Marcus added. Intelligence suggests they're planning something big, a final offensive to try to crush the resistance before more systems declare independence. As they walked toward the farmhouse, Lyra's communication device chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at the sender and her expression grew troubled. It's from my father personally this time, she said, reading the text. The High Council has made a formal decision. I'm being recalled to Velthari space. If I don't come willingly, they'll send ships to escort me home. Marcus felt a chill run through him. They can't do that. You're a free citizen of New Terra now. Technically, I'm still a Velthari citizen, and subject to their laws regarding royal succession. If the High Council decides I'm needed at home, they have the legal authority to compel my return. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table with Marcus's parents and several other resistance leaders, the conversation inevitably turned to Lyra's situation. You could refuse to go, suggested Captain Elena Vasquez, who had arrived that afternoon with dispatches from the United Human Colonies. Renounce your citizenship and claim asylum here. And start a diplomatic crisis that could split the resistance? Lyra shook her head. The Velthari are our most powerful allies. I can't risk damaging that relationship over my personal freedom. But is it really just personal? Asked David Chen. The way I see it, this is about the same principle we've been fighting for all along. The right to choose your own path in life. Sarah Chen nodded in agreement. You've spent 2 years proving that you don't need a throne to be a leader. The question is whether your people can see that. Over the following days, as Lyra wrestled with her decision, Marcus found himself thinking about their long journey together. From that first night in the gambling den to their current position as leaders in a galactic rebellion, they had always faced their challenges together. I have an idea, he said, as they took a walk through the fields surrounding the farm. What if you went back to Velthari space, but not as a surrendering princess? What do you mean? Go back as a representative of the resistance. Make your case to the High Council. Show them that the war is bigger than any single world or species. Convince them that the future lies in cooperation between free peoples, not in traditional monarchy. Lyra considered this. You think they might listen? I think you've already proven that their way isn't the only way. You've built alliances they never thought possible, freed thousands of beings from slavery, and helped create a movement that's reshaping the galaxy. If that doesn't earn you the right to speak your mind, nothing will. 3 days later, a Velthari diplomatic ship arrived in orbit around New Terra. But instead of the military escort that Lyra had feared, it carried a single passenger, her father, High Counselor Aldrich. The reunion was emotional but tense. Aldrich was a tall, imposing figure with the same violet eyes as his daughter, but where Lyra radiated warmth and compassion, he projected authority and ancient dignity. You have changed much. My daughter, he said as they met in the Chen family's parlor. When you disappeared, we feared the worst. When we learned you were alive but chose to stay among aliens, we were confused. And now? Now we see what you have accomplished, and we begin to understand. But understanding does not change our need for strong leadership. The Velthari face difficult times ahead, even if we win this war. We need you to come home. Marcus and his parents had discreetly withdrawn, giving father and daughter privacy for their conversation. But through the thin walls, they could hear the intensity of the discussion. You speak of duty to our people, Lyra was saying. But what about duty to all the beings who are fighting for their freedom? The Zephyrians who lost their homeworld, the humans whose colonies are under threat, the artificial beings who are just discovering what it means to have consciousness? They are not our responsibility, Aldrich replied. The Velthari must think first of the Velthari. That kind of thinking is exactly what allowed the hegemony to gain power in the first place. Every species focused only on their own interests, and nobody stood together until it was almost too late. The argument continued for hours, with neither side yielding ground. Finally, as the evening grew late, they seemed to reach an impasse. I cannot force you to come home, Aldrich said wearily, but I can make it clear that if you refuse, you will be abdicating your claim to the throne. Another heir will be chosen, and you will no longer be considered Velthari royalty. Marcus expected Lyra to be devastated by this ultimatum, but when she emerged from the parlor, she seemed oddly relieved. He's given me exactly what I needed, she told Marcus as they walked out onto the porch under the stars. A choice. A real choice with real consequences, but a choice nonetheless. And I choose to stay. I choose to continue fighting alongside the resistance. Not as a princess trying to reclaim her throne, but as someone who believes that freedom is worth more than any crown. The next morning, as Aldrich prepared to depart, he had one final conversation with his daughter. You are certain of this decision? I am. then I will not try to change your mind. But I want you to know that regardless of what the High Council decides, you will always be my daughter. And if you ever wish to return home, you will be welcome. As the Velthari ship disappeared into hyperspace, Lyra stood with Marcus watching it go. Any regrets? He asked. About giving up a throne to continue fighting for what I believe in? No, she turned to smile at him. About choosing to build a life here with people who see me as more than just my bloodline or my abilities? Definitely not. 6 months later, the hegemony finally collapsed. The combination of military pressure, economic disruption, and internal rebellion proved too much for their corrupt system to withstand. In the chaos that followed, dozens of new governments emerged. Most of them based on principles of freedom and self-determination that the resistance had championed. Marcus and Lyra were among the founders of the Galactic Freedom Alliance, a loose confederation of independent worlds committee